All right, what's up everyone? This is Don with Third Creative, and this is the walkthrough tutorial video for Battlefield Football Photoshop template. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the layers, cover all of the processes, and hopefully cover anything and everything that you might need to know in order to create the best images possible with this design. As always, I'm going to be pretty thorough, so if you're looking for something in particular, you're welcome to skim through and find what you're looking for. But otherwise, I'm going to go through this thing from bottom to top, and let's jump into it. As always, I do like to start with the bottom layer folder, and in this case we have our background layers. We'll open it up and see what we're working with here. So these bottom two layers, I've got a football texture. So you can see in these rips and these tears, this football texture is showing through. If I turn the football texture off, I get a solid color. So if you want a solid color, you can turn that football texture off and choose any color that you like. Just double click on this icon here, use the slider and pick the color that you like. Of course, you can also drop your own texture in here. I have, if I open it up, it's just a picture of a football that I photographed myself, and I've got that in there, and I've got it scaled to where it fits, but you can throw anything in there if you're wanting to use this for something other than football. The football texture has a levels adjustment on it, and it has a hue saturation adjustment layer. So there are some sample images. If I switch over here, you can see where I was changing the color of the football texture. So I've got red here, I've got gold, I've got natural, I've got orange. You've got a lot of options. So if you want to change the color, you can click on this hue saturation smart filter. And right now it's just slightly desaturated, and I've got the lightness and darkness turned up a little bit. If you want it to be a solid color, of course you can play with this natural and adjust the saturation, lightness, and darkness. But if you want a solid color, just click on this little colorized box here. It will desaturate it quite a bit. By default, you can bring the saturation up, find the color that you're looking for. So if we wanted orange, we could come somewhere here in the orange, play with the lightness and the darkness and the level of saturation to get the color that you want. If you want white, just desaturate it completely, and you can bring the lightness up. Bring it up too much, you start to lose the detail. So if you do want white, I would probably leave it right here around 0-ish on your lightness and darkness. Just desaturate it all together. You can close out and switch over to the levels. So I just open this levels panel here, and if you want it white, what I would do is just click on this right anchor point and slide it to the left, and that way you can retain some of these darks. You can also move this middle one to the left, play around with it until you get a level of contrast that works or looks good to you. That is how you would get a pure white. Let's go back and turn this off. I think I left it a little too saturated. Yeah, I think we had it somewhere in here. You know what I can do? Let's just go back to the beginning. There we go. All right, so next we have a subfolder, which I have field background layers. So if I open it up, we're going to see quite a bit in here. Come to the bottom of this subfolder, we have our bleachers / sky. I'm going to open this smart object. This is basically the primary background image that we're working with. There is a hue saturation layer or smart filter that's on here, which I have the saturation boosted a little bit. You can always play with that if you want. And I have field blur, so it may be hard to tell, but back here is considerably more blurry than over here, and that's just to create a little bit more depth of field, or the appearance of it. You can turn that off if you want everything to be more in focus, or you can adjust it if you want to jump into that and get into those kind of details. We've got our lights on folder. So these are basically the left light and the right light. It's full of layers that you probably don't really want to mess with, but I didn't merge them all. So you can look at that and how that's set up. Really not much to do there. Probably leave it as it is, assuming that you want the lights on. So we do have a background fog / atmosphere, and I have a adjust opacity in here. So this folder is what, at 80%. You can reduce that, you can increase it a little bit, or you can come in and there's several independent fog layers that we have in here that you can play around with if you want to. You can reduce the opacity, you can duplicate some of them. It's pretty subtle. I just didn't want it to have a little bit of atmosphere back there. So if you turn it off, you can see it darkens up quite a bit. Next we have our background color grade options. So there's a lot in here. I came up with something that I thought looked good for this, and it'll look good for a lot of other subject images and uniform colors that you put in here. But just to kind of explain what I have here, I have two solid color overlays. This one is set to this bluish color. I have one set to orange. I have the blend mode at soft light, and I have the opacity just at 10% on this one and 20% on this one. Now you can play around with this. You can turn off some of them and see what they do. So if I turn off blue, you can see it really warms up. If I turn off the orange, it tones down a little bit. And again, opacity has a lot to do with how much of an effect you'll see. But I thought this combination of orange and blue looked good. Kind of enhances the oranges in the sky, but also brings out some of the blues that you see in the bleachers. Now, I have 3 color lookups or LUTs, and they are all at relatively low opacity. This one's 15%. It's the horror blue. These are all standard preloaded LUTs that come with Photoshop CC, so nothing that I've created on my own. We've got 10% on winter, and then crisp warm, we've got 10%. These just kind of add a little extra contrast and warmth. You can see if I turn that off, the change. If I turn it back on, some of these are pretty subtle, but again, I came up with a combination. I mean, that's 5 things. It's quite a bit more than the norm, but if you want to play around with any of these, you can, depending on if you want cooler or warmer. You can adjust the opacities and of course the colors on these two. If you turn it all off, you can see, you know, it's just a little bit warmer and less contrast if you turn it off altogether. This next folder is a black and white background option. So if you turn it on, you can see we get black and white. If we open this folder up, it basically is a hue saturation, and so if I open it up, you can just see that I reduced the saturation level to 0. But I also lost my place here. Here we go. I also have this levels adjustment, and that just kind of lightened it up a little bit. So if you turn this off, you can see it darkens it quite a bit. So you may want a darker black and white, and if you do, you can turn this levels off. You can also double click on this icon here to get your levels properties, and you can play with these 3 anchor points, well, actually 5 anchor points. And so I have the darks reduced. If I bring them back to the left, you can see they come back. You can play with that if you want the darks to be reduced. I have the lights increased. You can move this around and see what it does. This is for your midtones right here in the middle, and then of course your darks all the way to the left. If you wanted to reduce the lights, you could do that. If you're familiar with curves, you can also use curves, but I just threw levels in here because it's a little simpler and easier to work with. But when you're going for black and white, depending on how bright or dark you want it, you can play with this levels adjustment to get the look that you're looking for. Next we have a colorized background, and that should be blue. Let me fix that. Colorize background. If you turn it on, it is set to orange by default, but it's basically a hue saturation layer, and it is set to colorize. And so you just use the slider to get the hue that you're looking for, and then you can adjust it using the lightness, darkness, and the level of saturation. Pretty simple. So you got all kinds of color options in here, as you can see. You can turn that off. Now, I will say that the black and white, if I have it on, if you turn it off, it affects, you know, what it looks like as well. So these all work together. You may or may not want all of these turned on, the color grading, the black and white. You can find a combination that works good for you in the look that you're going for. Next, we have the actual field background layers subfolder itself, which you'll see this layer mask on here, and this is where we're getting these rip tear effects. And so if you hold down shift and click on the layer mask itself, you can turn the layer mask off. And so you can see that, let's see, let's turn off a couple of these. There we go. You can see that that's a good look too. So if you don't want the aggressiveness with the rips and the tears, or if you don't want the football texture showing, just turn this layer mask off and you get a similar but different look. Turn it back on, hold down shift and click on the mask. There is a drop shadow, so you can see it just kind of gives a little bit of depth and realism to it. You can open this up and you can adjust the distance, the size, and the opacity of the drop shadow. If you get to where you have your colors the way you want them and the shadow isn't dark enough, or it's too dark, you can adjust that if you want to. And that is everything that falls in the background layers folder. Next, we have our subject images. Pretty self-explanatory. This is the folder where you will place your subject images, scale them. Rather than having a layer mask on it or a gradient mask on it, I decided to go with a solid color for the foreground and put a layer mask on that. And that way you don't start to see the background through the subject's legs, since we have so much detail in the background rather than just like a color behind them, a solid color. So once you change your background color, let's actually go back and just so you can see it. If I colorize this to red, now black doesn't look bad, but you could change that to a darker red. But just pick a color that works well with the background color of the sky that you're working with. More often than not, black will work pretty well, but you have the option to change that if you want to. There is a gradient mask on it. I set it to where it looks good with this image. There may be some situations like if they're holding their helmet down low, which I think I have some examples of that somewhere. Yeah, you can see they're holding the helmet. So you might want to adjust it so you can see a little bit more. It's not hard to do. I'll show you. One option is to unlink it or unlock it, just clicking on this little chain link icon here. And then you can use your move tool, make sure you select the mask. Now I can click on an anchor point, hold down shift, click anywhere in the middle and drag it down. It'll start to reveal more. Another option is to click and drag down here, and basically that will make it a little more of an abrupt transition. So that is one way that you can do it. And then of course you can always select your gradient tool, make sure you have black to white, click and drag. I hold down shift to keep the line straight. I did it backwards, I always seem to do that, and adjust it this way. So 3 different ways that you can adjust that, but that's a very common question that I get, is how to adjust these layer masks. Next we have a vignette, which is a levels layer, and so if you turn that off, you can see it lightens up the corners quite a bit. So once you get your colors and everything the way you want them, especially if you go with a real light and like white or desaturated bright background, you might want to reduce this. So you can come up here. What I've done is adjusted the mids. So I've got the mids pulled over all the way to 65. You can move it back and get the opposite effect. Or you can work with the darks. Just keep in mind, you don't want to be too aggressive because levels does affect the saturation. You can see it's getting really overly saturated up there. So if you stick with the mids, you've got a little bit of room to work with. Where do we have it? 65, something like that. And of course you can just turn it off if you don't want it. Next, we have lower foreground fog adjust opacity. And so the folder itself is at 100%. You're not going to adjust opacity. I mean, you could reduce it if it's more prominent than you want it to be. But if you turn it off, you can see it just gets a little flatter, darker at the bottom. But if you open it up, there's 3 layers in here. The bottom one is at 30%, middle one is at 20%, and the top one is at 50%. So you can, increase it. You may not want to go to 100%, but if you want a little bit more, you've got some room to work with there. And we'll just leave it there. All right, so next we have another color lookup and another solid color overlay that's set to soft light. And so if I turn that off, you can see it still looks good without it. But this is just another way that you can add a little more contrast, or in this case, warm contrast that I was going for. And because it's not clipped to the subject folder or any folder, it will just blanket apply it to the entire image, and it kind of ties it all together. There may be some scenarios where you don't want this. A good example, if I come back to this background layers, if you were going for black and white, well, these would add some warmth to it, kind of more sepia. So if you want a true black and white, you would want to turn these off. Or if you don't want them affecting, whatever color it is that you have this set up as, you can turn them off. Of course, you can change the color, and you can also change the opacity. This is very subtle. It's only 5%. So if I start to bring that up, you can see what it does. You can definitely get carried away with it, so you don't want to be too aggressive. But these are just some additional color grading options that kind of help tie everything together. Let's turn that back off. Okay. Next, we have our lower triangle. So if I turn that off, you can see it's the year text layer and the triangle that's in there. It's not a lot in here. So basically we have a shape layer that is the triangle. So if you want it to be a different color than the surrounding color, you can control the color with the gradient overlay. So just double click right here on gradient overlay. This will get your layer style panel up, and it's on gradient overlay. You may already have some gradients in here that you can choose from. Let's see, throw orange in there. You can pick one. Otherwise, if you click on this box here, the color itself, it brings up your gradient editor. It's real simple. This box here is the lower, darker color. You can just pick anything. And then this is for your lighter color, which is more towards the top. Click here, pick the color that you want, and you can adjust it. There is a stroke outline. Let's actually say we didn't do that. Right here, if you click on stroke, this is the little stripe here. It's just a solid color, so you can change it to white or anything that you want. I did notice in some of my sample images that I wanted it to be a little thicker, so you can increase the size if you want a little more thickness on the stroke outline. It's another option. Then we do have the text layer. It has a drop shadow on it with this black. It looks good. It helps it stand out a little bit, but you may want to turn that drop shadow off. If you go with a different color scheme, it may be too much. Some of my sample images, I turned it off. Some of them, I kind of reduced the darkness of it or the opacity of it. Very simple. Just pick your text color up here, or if you double click to highlight everything, you've got your text box, color box here. Next we have a gloss layer, adjust opacity. So you can kind of see how it's kind of lighter at the top. This is just a shape layer that's clipped to the text layer. Shape layer is white. It's reduced to 60%. So if you want less, you can bring the opacity down even more. And then it has a little layer mask to create like a fade effect. And so if you turn it off, it's just solid. If you turn it on, it just kind of gives the appearance that it's glossy and a little more three-dimensional. And that's it for the lower triangle. We have our lower text layers. So let's look at this. When I created this design, it was almost a year ago for this team. I decided to go with an aggressive brush stroke font that I really like. It's called Lakeshore, and I did that even though I had to pay for a commercial license. A lot of people wanted this or asked for this to be put out as a template, and so I was looking at other fonts, and I did find one that is free for commercial use that works pretty well, but I decided to include them both. And if you are on the product page for this design, I've got a little graphic here, but basically it just shows you have two options. One is Lakeshore, the other's called Hey November. I've used Hey November and several other templates. One is free, but Lakeshore does require a commercial license, which as of right now it's $16. It'll probably stay at $16. Lakeshore has been around for a very long time. But there are links to download both, and it's just up to you. I personally like Lakeshore better for this design, but if you turn this off and turn on Hey November, that looks pretty solid too. So you've got both options just in case you don't want the added expense of a $16 commercial license. You can turn that off and roll with Hey November instead. Regardless of which one you use, you would change the color with the gradient, and that is how I get this look where it's a little bit darker at the bottom, a little bit brighter at the top. So it's the same thing. Select your darker lower color, select your brighter or lighter upper color here, get it how you want it. If you don't want to use a gradient, just turn it off, and then you can just pick a solid color. It just loses a little bit of the effect. There is a drop shadow on here, and of course you can reduce. It's 100% opacity. I'm on black, so if you went with a white background with white uniforms, 100% opacity is going to be too dark. That's a situation you would want to reduce this down a little bit. And the same thing applies to both of these first name font layer options. Next we have a subtext, which you can see down here. It's basically for senior, junior, sophomore, freshman. You can change it to anything that you want. I just have them set up that way. It's just a solid color, so you can use this color picker here to pick any color that you want. And then the last one we have is our last name, and so it is also just a solid color. There's no gradients or drop shadows or anything, but it does have a grunge texture. If I open it up, you can see I've got this kind of rusty metal that I desaturated, added some levels to it, changed the blend mode to multiply, and so you can see you get a little bit of a grunge effect. So if you turn it off, you just get solid color. You can turn it on. It's at 70%, so you can reduce it, or you can increase it if you want more of the effect, or you can go in and play around with the levels or the hue saturation if you want to. But otherwise it just adds a little more grittiness to it. And that is it for the lower text. The only other layer that we have here is the upper text. So this is pretty straightforward. This, I have the kerning set to 1080. That's kind of a random number, but when I put in Bulldog Football, I wanted some extra space in between each letter. And so when you put your text in there, if you're You know, if your team name is shorter or longer, you may want to adjust the kerning. And so in your character panel right here, the higher the value, the more space between your characters, the lower the value, the less space. So you can fine tune that. I have it currently with 2 different colors. I know that's not automation friendly, so if you're using some automation, you may need to stick with 1 color. If you want to retain 2 colors, especially since this is going to be, this isn't a player name, it's a team name. So at least for everyone on the team, it's going to be consistent. You can possibly take the time to, you know, to customize it. So if you double click on the T here in your layer panel, it highlights everything. Now I can click and drag to the left to highlight the team name rather than the sport name. Come up here, and then you can pick the color that you want. Same thing with football, or you know, if you convert this to work with any other sport, it's the same thing. It's set to white. You can change it to anything that you want. It's very simple. If you just double click and start typing, it's just going to stay with the first color, which is orange. And that is it. So that wasn't too bad. We kind of flew through that. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. There is a few things that I need to cover with a few of the other files. So let's quickly jump over to one of the horizontal team files and keep this thing moving. Okay, so now I have the 2x3 horizontal file pulled up. Not a lot to cover here, but I did want to explain this folder here, which is entitled rows. If we open it up, this is where we're going to insert our subject images. Now, I have 4 rows, so there are 4 subfolders here for each row. You may want to create something with 2 rows, 5 rows, 6 rows. You may want to create something different than what I have. So this is basically just a starting point for you. You'll need to adapt it to work with the structure that you want. So if we take a look here, I think what I'll do is turn off this lower color here so you can see, you know, what it looks like. I have gradient mass on each row, and so that creates a little bit of a fade on each row. So if I turn off, you can see there may be a situation where you don't want to bring this color up any higher, but you get some weird things showing through here. So something that you may consider doing is, let's see, this is row 1, this is row 2. Add a layer and just get like a soft round brush. This is 100%, and just try to match this lower background color, whatever it is, or a color that'll work. And if you're getting some of this background field showing through, you can just, you know, I'll change it to white so you can see that's not a look that we want, but you just kind of paint in this, what would be a dark color. You just won't see it as well if I use black, but you get the idea. You can paint in black or a darker color so that anything, this grass or bleachers, if anything's showing through, you know, that it doesn't. It's a little bit of some manual work, but you know, I have my players arranged in a way where it doesn't really show through, so it works. But if you need another row, you can duplicate a folder, which on a Mac I'm holding down, where is it, Command. Of course, you can right click and duplicate group, rename them, you can move them around. Let's undo those. And then of course you can redo your gradient mask. Now I talked about how to adjust gradient mask on the vertical file. I won't re-explain it, but the same thing, you may need to adjust your gradient mask by either unlocking it and working with the mask itself with the move tool, or by actually using your black to white gradient tool and redoing the gradient mask. Not much else really to talk about. Everything else is pretty much the same. So I think the only other thing is